Dust and the man in the saddle. The dust blew west that morning, a fine ochre mist curling off the ground like breath from a dying man's mouth. It clung to the air in thin ribbons, catching the weak light and turning it the color of rusted brass. The shape of a rider formed within that haze as if the wind itself had decided to conjure a man out of grit and memory. Celis Reeve sat slouched in a cracked saddle that had seen too many miles, the leather darkened not from care, but from sweat and storms. His hat brim was drawn low enough to shadow most of his face, though the parts the dust revealed spoke of hard roads. Skin weathered to the hue of forgotten earth, eyes narrowed as though sunlight was always an adversary. Beneath him, his mare Tether moved with a weary stubbornness that made her gait uneven, favoring one leg in a way that was more instinct than will. She was sway-backed, her flanks thin under the hide, but she followed the reins without protest, as if bound to him by something beyond loyalty. Everything about the pair carried the look of being used up, stitched together by sheer force of endurance rather than any expectation of comfort. Celis rode not like a man heading toward something, but like one drifting toward an inevitability. In his boot heel, a hidden coin pressed against his skin, the last of his resources, not enough to change his fortune, but just enough to serve its final purpose. Somewhere deeper, where the ribs narrowed over his lungs, a coil of guilt lay tight and unmoving, the kind that doesn't ease with miles. He guided Tether down the main street of Gallows Fork without speaking to anyone, not slowing for the saloon, not glancing toward the preacher on his porch. Gallows Fork was a place that no longer greeted strangers. The town simply let them pass like wind through a broken fence. Celis might as well have been invisible, and he preferred it that way. No one tried to draw him in, and he offered no reason for them to. By the time he reached the square, the auction was already in full swing. From a distance, it looked like any trade day gathering, but as he drew closer, the knot of men encircling the platform had a lean, circling patience that reminded him of buzzards waiting for something to collapse. The voices carried in short bursts the kind of bids people made less out of need and more for the thrill of winning over someone else. Sheriff Tumbler stood off to the side, his belly pushed forward under crossed arms, the brim of his hat tipped just enough to keep the sun from his wet, smirking lips. Beside him on the platform, the banker Colbrand read from a list in a voice that had been sharpened for just this sort of thing, precise, rehearsed, and carrying the faint tone of mockery. Everything was for sale now. Land lots that would never be sown again. Wagons with axles too warped to repair. Bed frames still bearing the linens of the people who'd slept their last sleep in them. Gallows Fork was a dying place, and this auction was its rattle, the auction scene. Colbrand's voice clipped through the dust-heavy air like a knife slicing paper. He stood with his ledger angled toward the light, each item ticked off with a crispness that suggested these were merely transactions, not remnants of lives. The crowd gathered tight in a crescent around the platform, sunburnt men with spurs tapping idly, eyes narrowing in calculation, not compassion. Laughter broke here and there, sharp and mean, the kind that doesn't need a joke to exist. Somewhere behind them, a dog barked once and then went silent, as if even animals knew this wasn't a place for noise. From his place near the fence, Celis kept his arms folded and his head dipped just enough to watch without inviting conversation. He hadn't come for plows or wagons, and certainly not for the rusted tools or bedding the banker was hawking. He had waited for the last lot, though he hadn't told himself why in any clear terms. Some part of him knew it would come the way a man knows the last card in a game he's been losing all night. The bidding moved with a strange rhythm, numbers thrown like stones into a still pond, each one sending a ripple through the crowd. Then Colbrand cleared his throat, glancing at the paper in front of him. Lot 72, he announced, his tone shifting to something faintly amused. Widow named Ruth Malden and her twin daughters. No dowry, no property. Bank assumes medical debts. Package sale. Who will start? The murmurs began immediately, half laughter, half something hungrier. In Gallows, Fork, the buying and selling of people wasn't framed as slavery. It was dressed up in legalities and debts, but the hunger in the eyes said otherwise. Someone called out $2 with a chuckle, as if starting a game. Another countered 3, and the circle leaned closer, not because they cared who won, but because they wanted to see how low a human life could be bartered for that day. Celis stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on the figures stepping onto the platform. The widow kept her head bowed. Her black dress faded to a brownish shade where the sun had eaten at it over too many seasons. Her hands were folded in front of her tight enough to blanch the knuckles as if holding something in place. Behind her came the twins, identical in size and pallor, their hair, the tangled gold of straw, left too long in the field. Their dresses, once blue, were worn thin and mismatched at the seams, the handiwork of repairs, done with whatever cloth could be found. One girl glanced up just long enough to meet Celis's gaze. Her eyes were flat, unreadable, no spark, no fear, just the stillness of something that had already seen too much. Lot 72. The bidding wavered after the first few calls. The men shifted, spitting into the dust or wiping their mouths with the backs of their hands. There was interest, yes, but it wasn't urgent. The widow's debts were public knowledge, her lack of property making her a burden rather than a prize. The twins' small pale things were of no practical use to men who measured worth in acres and muscle. Celis waited until the last chuckles began to fade, until the crowd's appetite moved toward indifference. Then he spoke, his voice so level it cut through the noise without rising. 10. Every head turned. Colbrand looked up from his paper, one brow lifting. $10. His gaze was skeptical, but tinged with a banker's instinct. Cash was cash. On hand, Celis reached into his coat and withdrew a folded bill, the edges worn soft from being handled too many times. It was all that remained from selling his dead brother's watch, a trade that had cost more sentiment than he'd admit. He walked it forward and handed it over without ceremony, not meeting the eyes of the men who leaned back to get a better look at him. The banker barely hesitated before calling it. The hammer fell with a sound that seemed far too small for the weight it carried. And just like that, Celis Reeve had bought the widow and her twin daughters. There was no pause for congratulations or comment. He stepped back, nodded once toward Ruth, and gestured for her and the girls to follow. The crowd parted in silence, curiosity curling behind their stares like smoke. No one asked what he wanted with them. No one needed to. In Gallows, Fork, a purchase was a possession. Celis led them out of the square, away from the stench of sweat and dust, thick with the scent of greed. The widow said nothing, the girls less. They walked behind him in lockstep, their heads down, the sound of their small shoes barely audible over the wind. Somewhere behind them, the auctioneer was already calling the next lot, moving on as though nothing had just shifted in the bones of 4 lives. The shack on the burned prairie. The road out of Gallows Fork thinned to little more than a pair of wagon ruts, brittle grass swaying on either side. The widow and her daughters followed without complaint, their pace steady, as if they'd already measured the distance in their minds and accepted it. The land spread out flat and wide empty except for the low blackened sweep of prairie where fire had run wild seasons ago. It was here, at the far edge of what anyone would still call habitable, that Celis stopped. The shack leaned to its right, like a drunk losing his balance, the roof sloping in surrender to years of neglect. Only one window broke the plank wall, a square hole with a blanket nailed across it in place of glass. The door hung stubbornly to a single hinge. The place was more shelter in theory than in practice, but it had been his for the last year, and that counted for something. Celis pushed the door open with the side of his boot, letting them enter first. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mice. The cot sagged in the corner, its thin mattress worn into a permanent shape. A stove sat rusted in its throat, the door warped, and the only table looked like it had been gnawed at by time or teeth. On the floor lay a patchwork of old quilts he'd gathered from abandoned homes, laid down more for the illusion of comfort than for warmth. Ruth stepped inside without hesitation. She glanced once around the room, her gaze sweeping over the broken corners and peeling boards. Then she dropped her small satchel to the floor and went to work smoothing the quilts with quick, efficient motions. She brushed dust from the corners with her sleeve as though she'd done this in a dozen places before. One of the twins, he still couldn't tell them apart, dragged a stool to the stove and perched on it, her small hands resting on her knees like she was settling in to watch something unfold. The other stayed close to Ruth, standing without moving eyes, tracking every detail of the room. Celis unhitched tether, letting the mare drink from a bucket of rainwater collected in the barrel outside. When he came back in, he crouched by the stove, twisted a bundle of dried grass into the grate, and struck flint until the flame took. The warmth spread slow, creeping into the corners like a wary animal. That night, no one spoke. The wind found its way through the cracks in the boards, whistling in a way that made the place feel smaller. He gave them the cot and lay down by the door with his coat for a blanket, his rifle close enough to reach without looking. Sleep came shallow, filled with the scent of cold air and wood smoke. When he woke, there was the taste of blood in his mouth, though he had no memory of biting his tongue or grinding his teeth. He didn't ask about dreams, and neither did they. First night and morning work. The morning broke with a frost that made the grass near the creek sparkle like glass. Ruth moved quietly in the dim light, setting a dented pot on the stove. From somewhere in the satchel she produced beans that were more husk than seed, and onion peel so thin it was almost paper. By the time the scent rose into the air, Celis was up shrugging into his coat and checking the rifle out of habit. She didn't ask where his money had come from, nor what he wanted in exchange for the $10. Instead, she looked toward the sagging fence line beyond the field and said, "It needs mending." Her voice was flat, not a suggestion, but a statement of fact. He handed her a hammer and a bucket of bent nails, and together they walked the length of the fence. The twins trailed them, their steps soft in the frost-hardened earth. Neither played nor complained. One knelt to hold planks steady, while the other gathered scattered nails into an old tobacco tin, her fingers quick and precise. The morning passed in the slow rhythm of work. Boards lifted, nails straightened, the hammer's dull ring carrying over the still air. Ruth worked without pause, her hair catching the light in streaks of pale brown and silver. She never turned her back fully to the open field, always keeping one eye toward the tree line. Celis noticed, too, the way the twins watched everything, not like curious children, but like creatures measuring threat. When the wind shifted, their heads turned in perfect unison. Once, when a hawk circled low over the field, one of them hissed through her teeth a sound so sharp it made the bird wheel away without another pass. He began calling them red and blue for the scraps of ribbon tied in their hair. They didn't correct him. He doubted it mattered. By midday, the fence was whole again, or as whole as it had been in years. Ruth handed back the hammer without ceremony and wiped her hands on her skirt. The twins emptied the tobacco tin into the bucket and set it by the door before retreating inside. It was work done as if they'd all been living there for years, each person falling into a place that fit without discussion. And yet beneath the ordinary rhythm, something else lay coiled, waiting. He couldn't name it then, but he felt it as surely as the cold in his bones, noticing the strange. Over the next few days, the strangeness became less something glimpsed and more something constant, woven into every movement Ruth and the girls made. Ruth never sat with her back to the door, even when it meant taking the worst seat in the room. She'd pause mid-task to glance toward the window at sounds Celis hadn't heard. The twins were quieter still. They moved in mirror-perfect patterns, one stepping aside just as the other stepped forward, never colliding, never fumbling. If a nail rolled off the table, one would already be reaching to catch it before it hit the floor. They didn't flinch at thunder or wind, but silence, true silence, made their shoulders tighten. Their eyes dart to the corners of the room as though expecting something to emerge. When he asked them to fetch water from the creek, they returned with a bucket brimming, not a drop spilled. Once on a day, when clouds hung low and the air felt heavy with storm, he saw them at the edge of the field drawing in the dirt with sticks. Circles inside squares, jagged trees with roots curling backward into themselves. He crouched to study the marks later, but the patterns meant nothing to him. The ribbons in their hair never changed color, but he began to suspect the scraps weren't there for his convenience. They were there to tell him something, what he couldn't yet say. By the week's end, the house felt altered. Not in appearance, but in weight, as if whatever these three had brought with them had seeped into the walls. The stove burned hotter. The drafts through the boards seemed less sharp. Even the nights, while still long and restless, carried fewer sounds from the prairie beyond. Celis didn't know whether to take comfort in that or not. Ruth sharpening the knife. It was late, the kind of night where the wind pressed hard against the shack's boards and made the nails groan in protest. Celis had been sitting by the door, half dozing with the rifle laid across his knees when he noticed movement by the stove. Ruth sat on the low stool, a whetstone in her lap, the dull kitchen knife in her hand. The scraping sound was steady, almost soothing if not for the purpose it served. She didn't glance up when we spoke. "They'll come for us." It wasn't a warning. It was an acknowledgement, the way a farmer might mention that winter was on its way. Celis leaned his shoulder into the doorframe. "Who men with oil on their boots?" she said, still drawing the blade along the stone. "Men who wear smiles too long. Men who own paper that says we're not ours." He didn't have to ask if she meant legal paper. He'd seen the kind claims deeds collection notices. the sort that made people disappear without anyone firing a shot. "You've dealt with them before," she added. He nodded, the memory of such men sour in his mouth. Ruth stopped sharpening and finally looked at him. Her eyes were gray, not the soft gray of river stones, but the cold, unyielding gray of forged iron. "I'm not afraid of dying," she said plainly. "But I won't have them take the girls." The fire popped in the stove, casting a flicker of light across her face. In it, Celis saw no desperation, no tremor, just a promise she'd already made to herself and would see through with or without his help. He didn't offer false assurances. He just nodded because he understood in the same way a man understands the sound of a wolf's howl in the distance. Low, certain, promising ruin. That night he didn't sleep. The wind rattled the boards and he kept his eyes on the door. Across the room the twins curled into each other under their quilt, silent as stones. Ruth lay on the cot, the knife under her hand, her breathing so steady it was as though she were already part of the stillness around her. Early spring. Spring didn't arrive in Gallows Fork so much as it had to be wrestled from the frost. The ground softened in reluctant patches, the air losing its bite only for a few hours at a time before cold crept back in. Celis took to working the field behind the shack, digging a narrow trench from the creek to guide water toward the furrows he'd cut weeks earlier, more out of habit than belief in a harvest. Ruth planted herbs in cracked tin cups, her hands moving with a tenderness he'd never seen her show to people. She knew the names of each, though she spoke them only once, almost under her breath, like they were part of a prayer. The twins helped, without being told, fetching water and setting the cups in the sun's brief warmth. One evening, as he returned from checking traps, Celis heard a sound from the edge of the field. The twins were drawing patterns again, their sticks tracing careful lines, circles inside squares, jagged trees, shapes he couldn't decipher. When a fox padded too close, its paws silent on the thawing ground, both girls turned at the exact same moment. They whispered together in a language he'd never heard, low and fluid like wind slipping through tall grass. The fox stopped mid-step. Then, without a sound, it turned and vanished back into the brush. Celis didn't ask what they had said. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Some nights he'd catch Ruth humming at the stove, slow, mournful notes that might once have been a hymn. The moment she realized he was listening, she'd stop and busy herself with some task. It struck him that she smiled less with her mouth than with her silences, as if the act itself was too costly. The land began to change. Plants sprouted faster than they should have. The creek ran clearer. For the first time since the fire years ago, green began to spread over the prairie. It was life returning, though he had the uneasy feeling that something other than nature was coaxing it back. The rider arrives. It was late afternoon, the light sliding toward gold when Celis saw the dust on the ridge trail. One rider moving with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Tether shifted beneath him. Ears forward, but it was Ruth he noticed first, how she went still at the sink hands frozen over the basin as though she'd heard the hoof beats before anyone else. She dried her hands on her skirt, crossed the room, and took the knife from its place by the stove. Without a word, she pressed it into Blue's small hands. The girl tucked it beneath her apron and stepped behind the door. Red slipped soundlessly under the table. Celis stepped onto the porch, the rifle loose in his grip. The rider drew closer, a chestnut gelding beneath him, tack in perfect order, boots polished so clean they caught the fading light. His coat bore no dust. His smile clung too long to his lips. "Didn't mean to startle you," he called, stopping a few paces away. "Didn't," Celis replied flatly. "I'm just looking for someone." Widow Malden heard she might have come this way. Celis said nothing. The man dismounted, patting the satchel slung over his shoulder. She and her brats left a place up north. Belonged to a man owed more than coin. Bank's only half of it. I've got papers here, deeds, claims, collection orders. All clean, all stamped. I figure if she's here best, we sort it peaceably. I don't hold with violence." Celis's eyes dropped to the slight bulge under the man's coat, a pistol brass-handled and polished, the kind carried by someone not unfamiliar with blood. "She's not here," Celis said. The man's smile faltered just for a breath, then returned. "Mind if I take a look? I do." From the tree line movement caught Celis's eye. Another rider, then two more. 3 shadows fanning out wide in what they thought was subtlety. Inside, the floor creaked, once blue, no doubt shifting into position. "Friend," the man said, adjusting his coat. "I think you understand the weight of what you're trying to interfere with." "I understand enough," Celis replied. "You'll get one chance to walk away. No shame in it." "She's not yours." "Not really." Celis thought of Ruth's eyes over the knife, the twin stillness, the way the land had begun to breathe again. "She is now," he said. "The shootout." The man's nod was small, almost polite. Then he whistled. Everything happened in a rush. Gunfire cracked from the tree's splinters, leaping from the porch post, inches from Celis's head. He dove sideways, the rifle kicking against his shoulder as he fired toward the muzzle flash. One rider screamed, clutching his chest before tumbling out of the saddle. Another spurred his horse forward, pistol raised, but didn't get a shot off. Celis's second round sent him spinning to the ground. Inside, the door slammed open. Blue slid across the porch like smoke, low and fast, knife in hand. Her blade found the back of the lead rider's knee, severing tendon. He dropped with a howl, his pistol clattering into the dirt. Blood smeared her cheek, not from her own wound, but from crawling under the floorboards where she'd lain in wait. Ruth appeared next, one hand gripping Red's wrist. Without breaking stride, she pulled the girl past Celis and into the brush beyond the shack. They didn't look back. The third rider was still mounted, swinging his revolver toward Ruth's retreating figure. Celis caught the movement and fired the shot, catching the man high in the shoulder. He reeled in the saddle, dropping his weapon, and his horse bolted. The man on the ground, the one Blue had hamstrung, was reaching for his fallen pistol when Celis crossed the space between them. He kicked the weapon out of reach and brought the butt of the rifle down hard. Once, twice, until the man stopped moving. By the time the last echo of gunfire died, the clearing was littered with the wreckage of the fight-spilled cartridges, blood-dark patches in the dirt, and the bodies of men who'd come believing themselves untouchable. The air reeked of powder and iron. Celis stood still for a moment, breathing hard, listening for any sign of more. There was nothing but the wind and the distant creak of the shack's loosened boards. He had no idea how far Ruth had taken the girls, but he knew they'd find their way back. People like her always did. They'll send more. It was hours before Ruth returned. The sun was long gone, and the night had settled heavy over the prairie. She stepped into the yard without a word, her hair loose, the hem of her dress torn. Red followed close behind, silent as ever. Blue was already there, crouched by the stove with a rag in her hands, wiping the blood from her knife. "They'll send more," Ruth said finally, her voice low but certain. Xelis nodded, wiping the grit and sweat from his chin with the back of his hand. "Let them." No one spoke after that. Together they dragged the bodies far from the shack. No markers, no prayers, just dirt and the long, cold silence of an unmarked grave. When the work was done, Ruth went inside without glancing back. The girls followed. The shack was warm when Sailor stepped in, though the heat felt different now, less like comfort, more like the lingering warmth of something recently burned. He sat by the door again, the rifle across his knees, and listened to the steady breathing from the cot. In the stillness, he thought about the eyes he'd seen at the auction, hungry measuring, already counting the worth of the widow and her daughters. He thought about the men tonight and the ones who would follow and how they would come not out of need, but out of a belief that they were entitled to take. For the first time since he'd spent that $10, Sellers began to think maybe he hadn't been the one doing the saving after all. Summer growth. By midsummer, the land looked nothing like it had when he first brought them here. Green surged where he hadn't planted. Corn stalks rose straight and tall, their leaves whispering in the hot wind. Beans coiled up poles with an eagerness that felt almost alive. Ruth's herbs grew in strange, deliberate clusters near the base of the crops, and she moved them often, always barefoot, always at night, always under the moon. She never explained why. The twins worked with purpose. One at the well, one keeping watch from the hill at dawn. They didn't chatter. They didn't play. They weren't children in the usual sense. They were sentinels in small bodies, centuries old in their quiet. One afternoon, Sellers asked Ruth what they'd been before all this, before the auction, before the debts. She didn't hesitate. Born too early, she said, or maybe too late. Either way, they came wrong. Not weak, just different. The midwife tried to smother them with a pillow. Sellers didn't answer. He just poured her another cup of coffee. The shack changed too. Ruth patched the roof with strips of old canvas, tied bunches of wildflowers over the lintel, and braided sticks into a charm she hung above the window. The stove burned steadier now, the damp rot gone from the air, replaced by the faint, clean scent of pine and sage. Still, Salis kept the rifle close, because green fields and full bellies were just another kind of target. Quiet conversation at night. It was one of those nights where the air lay still heavy with the smell of rain that might never fall. The moon hung low and swollen over the prairie, painting the fields in a pale light that made the green look almost silver. Salas sat by the edge of the corn rows, a tin mug cooling in his hands, when Ruth came to stand beside him. She moved without sound, the way she always did, as if the earth itself had been taught not to betray her steps. "You ever wonder," she said, eyes on the horizon, "why men like that carry paper instead of knives?" He looked over at her. "Paper can be burned," he said. "Not if you believe in it," she replied. "Not if you believe the ink on it is more real than the blood in your vein." Her face was half in shadow, but he could see the fine lines the years had carved, lines that spoke of battles fought with silence as much as with steel. "Words on a page can do more damage than a blade," she said softly. "They can take everything from you without ever spilling a drop of blood." He nodded. "If no one fights back." She turned toward him, then her gray eyes like cold iron in the moonlight. "You think this place is safe?" "No. Then why stay?" He didn't answer right away. He thought of the creek that had begun to run clear again, the fields that grew stronger each day, the girl's watchful eyes, the way the land seemed to shift under their presence. He thought of the men who had already come, and the ones who would follow. Finally, he said, "Because it matters. Because you do." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she reached out and touched his arm, light brief like testing the warmth of a fire without committing to it, and walked back toward the shack. The gesture lingered long after she was gone. Sheriff's collapse. The next morning broke harsh and bright, the kind of light that made every flaw in the land stand out sharp. Silas was fixing a loosened hinge on the shack's door when the sound of a horse came fast up the trail. Not the measured pace of someone visiting, this was the uneven gallop of something pursued or pursuing. The sheriff of Gallows Fork rode into the yard, slumped in his saddle, his hat gone, his face gray under the dust. The horse's flanks were lathered, its eyes rolling white. The sheriff didn't make it to the porch. He slid sideways, crumpling into the dirt with one hand outstretched. Silas caught him under the arms, dragging him into the shade. The man stank of fear and sweat. His lips blistered, his boots torn at the seams. "Colbrand's dead," the sheriff rasped, gulping air between words. Bank went up in flames. Men came from the east. Not lawmen. Worse. His eyes darted toward the tree line. "They ride gray horses. Don't blink. One of 'em's a woman, hair white as bone, eyes like he broke off, coughing hard enough to bring up blood." Silas looked toward the shack. Ruth stood in the doorway, unmoving, the twins flanking her like shadows. "Who are they?" Silas asked. The sheriff shook his head, spittle and blood flecking his chin. "Don't know names." He convulsed once, then went still, his body slack in Silas's grip. Ruth stepped forward, crouched, and went through the man's coat without hesitation. She drew out a folded map, its creases spotted with blood. Her eyes moved over it quick and certain before she handed it to Silas. Gallows Fork was circled in red. So were 3 other settlements. Each had been burned. "They're not just looking for me now," she said. First foreshadowing of the Grey Riders. Silas studied the map longer than necessary. Though the meaning was clear enough, this wasn't a hunt for one woman. It was a purge, methodical and deliberate. Why, he asked. Ruth's answer came slow, as if she was weighing how much to give him. "Because I left." He looked at her, then not just the woman standing in the dusty yard, but really looked. The gray eyes that never seemed to rest, the sleeves that hid scars. The daughters who moved like predators, disguised as children. "What were you?" he asked. She didn't answer. That night the wind came down off the ridge hard enough to bend the trees. Ruth knelt in the dirt by the field, mixing ash and water, drawing shapes Gallas didn't know but felt in his bones. The twins hummed in unison from the loft above the sound, low and vibrating, not fit for daylight. Silas sat outside with his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the tree line. The wind carried no dust, no pollen, only a scent he couldn't place, sharp and metallic. At dawn he found tracks by the creek. Hoof prints. 4 sets. They'd stopped just at the edge of the field, watching, waiting. The silent approach. They came at dusk when the last edge of the sun bled out behind the hills, and the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no sound of hooves, no drifting plume of dust. One moment the prairie lay empty. The next 4 figures were there, half seen in the tall grass, their pale horses moving as if the ground flowed beneath them instead of being crossed. Kellis spotted them from the porch. He didn't call out, didn't need to. He knew Ruth was already watching from inside. The twins would have marked their scent an hour ago. He simply stood, hands loose at his sides, the rifle within reach, but untouched. The lead rider dismounted with the quiet grace of someone who had never truly been human. Her hair was white as lime wash braided down her back. The stillness in her face was not the stillness of peace, but of absence, as if nothing lived behind her eyes. Those eyes didn't reflect light. They drank it. Behind her, 3 men sat their horses, without shifting, their coats hanging heavy, their boots bone-colored and clean. Kellis noticed something unsettling. No tracks formed in the grass where they'd passed. The woman's gaze swept the yard, pausing on the shack before settling on him. Her voice, when it came, was not unkind, but hollow, like wind moving through a hollowed tree. "You've taken in the cast-offs." Kellis said nothing. "She stole from us," the woman continued. "Not coin, not land. Blood promise. She took what was given form and made it human. Verbal duel." The door creaked open behind him. Ruth stepped into view, barefoot, hair unbound, eyes unreadable. "I returned what you ruined," she said. The white-haired woman tilted her head slightly, like an animal listening to a distant sound. "You broke the binding. That comes with a price." "You didn't earn them," Ruth said. "You bred them for power." The woman's lips curved faintly, not a smile exactly, more the ghost of one. "We didn't breed them. We shaped them. They were born from pain, same as you. They're not yours. They are unfinished. They belong where they began." Ruth took a single step forward. "You want them back?" Her voice was low, almost daring. "They're mine now." The woman's gaze slid to Kellis. "And you? Do you think you found a cause worth dying for? That rifle won't save you." Kellis didn't look away. "I'm not aiming to be saved." For the first time, the woman's eyes narrowed, a thin crack in her mask of stillness. "We warned you." The clash. They moved without drawing weapons, crossing the yard in a blur of unnatural speed, cloaks billowing like wings. Kellis had his rifle up in a heartbeat, firing once only to see the shot tear. Bark from a tree 10 feet away, as if the bullet had been pulled off course. He fired again, this time clipping one of the men who staggered but didn't fall. From the porch, Ruth's voice rose, not English, not any language Kellis knew. It was thick with rage and something older than words. The ground beneath the riders shivered. Then the twins struck. Red came from the roof blade, flashing in the dying light, slicing deep into the tendon of a pale horse. Blue slipped from beneath the porch, flinging a handful of dust into another rider's eyes. He screamed as if it burned. The wind changed sharp, cold smelling of iron. The sigils Ruth had carved into the earth the night before began to glow faintly, their lines pulsing underfoot. The white-haired woman opened her arms as if to welcome the wind, but it turned against her. Her riders faltered. Ruth stepped forward, her palms out, her voice dropping to a command that made the air vibrate. "Leave." The woman's answer was a flat promise. "You can't keep them hidden forever." "I'm not hiding them," Ruth said. "I'm showing them what it means to be free." The woman spat into the dirt. It smoked where it landed. Then she whistled, sharp and low. The riders turned as one, even the injured, and vanished into the tall grass as suddenly as they'd appeared. The silence afterward was absolute. Autumn preparations. Autumn came early that year, its edge sharp and metallic in the wind. The leaves turned copper and curled in on themselves, dying fast as if they knew something was coming. Celis felt it too, an unseen weight pressing down on the prairie, the kind of stillness that came before a siege. The shack became less a home and more a fortress, though its walls were thin and its roof still patched with canvas. Ruth worked in the evenings carving symbols into bone wood and stone, hanging them under the eaves, burying them at the gateposts. Celis didn't ask what each mark meant. He learned enough from the way the twins handled them gently, almost reverently. The girls began collecting things that made no sense to him. Bird skulls bleached by the sun, strips of black cloth, rusted hinges from abandoned doors. They stored them in a wooden crate beneath the loft, never speaking of their purpose. One morning, Red came back from the tree line carrying a rabbit. It wasn't dead, but it didn't move its eyes wide and unblinking. She placed it on the ground at Celis's feet and looked up at him. "Show me," she said. He hesitated. "Show you what? How to end it?" Her voice was calm, without malice, without cruelty, just expectation. He crouched beside her and without embellishment did as his father had taught him long ago. Quick, clean, without unnecessary pain. Red's eyes didn't waver. When it was done, she lifted the rabbit by its hind legs and carried it away without a word. That night, over a supper of bread and beans, she sat silent beside Blue, both of them eating with an unhurried precision. Celis wondered, not for the first time, if they felt more than they let on. When he asked Ruth, she only said more than most. The first frost and the scream. The frost came sudden and heavy, laying a pale shroud over the field. The beans shriveled in their pods. The corn cracked under its own weight. Even Ruth's herbs, which had thrived against all odds, withered in the cold. She stood barefoot in the garden, eyes closed, hands at her sides. "It's a sign," she said without turning, "of what Celis asked. Something's gone wrong in the places beneath." He didn't press her for details. Some answers were worse than ignorance. That night the scream came. It tore through the dark like a blade, high and unearthly, waking every bird in the trees for miles. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was something caught between something that had no right to exist. The twins sat up in their loft the instant it started, not frightened, but alert, like soldiers hearing a distant horn. "They've opened a door," Ruth said from the shadows by the stove. At dawn, Celis found hoof marks circling the field. Blood and ash were scattered along the perimeter. Whatever had walked there hadn't crossed the fence line. A warning, or a promise. Ruth's decision to leave. That afternoon, Celis found Ruth packing not clothes, not food, but objects. Strange talismans tied with thread-carved jawbones etched with unfamiliar markings. Bundles of dried plants, bound so tight they looked like fists. "We need to go," she said. "How far?" "Up the bluff." "The cabin?" "No," she cut in. "Farther, where the old chapel burned." Celis frowned. "That's 30 miles north. Nothing left but black stones and a fallen bell. That's the point. There's silence there, and silence is the only thing they fear." He didn't argue, though the thought of leaving the shack unsettled him. They'd bled into this place, made it theirs. But he could see it in her eyes. She wasn't asking. They packed light, rope, food enough for a few days. The rifle, always the rifle. The twins walked without speaking, each holding one of Ruth's hands. Celis took the rear eyes on the trail behind them as the prairie swallowed their footprints. By nightfall, the chapel ruins rose out of the dark like the bones of some great creature. The wind here was different, sharper, thinner, whistling through the stones like breath through cracked teeth. The place felt hollow, but not empty. Ruth began laying out her objects in a circle. The girls stepped into the center, knees touching hands, clasped. Silas took his place at the edge, the rifle across his chest. "What happens now?" he asked. "They come," she said. The 9 riders arrive. The wind died all at once. Not a lull, an absence, as though the air itself had been pulled from the land's lungs. The sound of crickets ceased, and even the distant creak of the chapel's blackened timbers went still. Silas felt the change in his bones before he saw them. The horizon darkened in a way that had nothing to do with clouds. One by one shapes slid into view, not riding toward them so much as appearing their pale horses, moving without lifting hooves, gliding across the grass like shadows freed from a body. There were 9 this time. The 3 men he'd seen before were there, but changed faces, stretched or smoothed as though carved from wax. Behind them came others, all wearing the same absence of life in their eyes. At their head, the white-haired woman walked barefoot across the stones, though she no longer looked entirely human. Her mouth was gone, her features rigid, her glassy eyes reflecting nothing but oil-dark shine. She didn't stop at the edge of Ruth's circle. Her voice came from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground, through the marrow. "Give them back." Ruth didn't break her chant. The twins sat unmoving in the circle's center, their clasped hands trembling only slightly. The battle in the circle. The riders dismounted, not with the fluidity of men, but with the folding collapse of something returning to an old shape. One stepped forward, its joints bending wrong, its head twitching like a broken puppet. Silas fired. The shot cracked through the dead air and vanished. Not missed, not deflected. Gone. The rider caught it midair without touching it, swallowing its sound and heat into nothingness. He fired again. Same result. Then Red rose from the circle, her eyes fixed on a single rider. She didn't speak. She just pointed, and the air buckled a heat shimmer through blood. The rider convulsed and dropped its limbs, twisting backward in angles no human could survive. Blue followed. She opened her mouth and released something that wasn't a sound so much as a shape, dense, heavy, pressing against the inside of Silas's skull. The stones beneath them cracked, and another rider split down the middle like rotted wood. The white-haired woman stepped forward, her hands rising into claws, or maybe roots, or maybe wires. The shapes shifted as she moved, as if she was every nightmare held in a single form. Silas didn't think. He dropped the rifle and stepped into the circle. Pain slammed into him like a wall, setting every vein on fire. But he kept moving, placing a hand on each girl's shoulder. "I'm here," he said. "Whatever this is, I'm with you, breaking the enemy." The twins opened their eyes at the same time, and something ancient opened with them. It didn't come from the sky or the ground. It came from inside, as if the circle itself was a door they had just unlatched. Light burst outward. Not white, not red, but a color that felt like memory made visible. It carried screams and lullabies, the rattle of chains, the heat of fire, the ache of breath held too long. The riders staggered, their shapes unraveling under its weight. The white-haired woman screamed not from her throat, but from everywhere, her voice tearing the air. Her body came apart into smoke bone and teeth scattering across the black stones before dissolving entirely. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but the presence of peace, heavy, grounded, final. The twins sagged against Silas, unconscious but breathing. Ruth dropped to her knees, blood running from her nose. "It's done," she whispered. You sure? Celis asked. She gave him the ghost of a smile. No. They stayed in the ruins until dawn, the stars returning one by one as if sewing the sky back together. When the sun finally touched the stones, the frost was gone. Grass sprouted green in the cracks. Walking home, they left the chapel ruins in the soft light of early morning. The stones behind them still held the warmth of whatever had happened there, a subtle heat that seeped through the soles of their boots as they crossed the threshold and stepped back into the world. The walk home was long, but they didn't take the direct path. Ruth led them through the winding stretches of pine-shadowed woods where the air smelled of resin and the ground was soft with needles. The twins walked close to her, each small hand wrapped around one of hers. Their steps were slow but steady, no sign of exhaustion on their faces, only a watchfulness that never seemed to fade. Celis took the rear, his rifle slung across his back, scanning the trail behind them. He didn't expect the riders to return, not right away, but habits like vigilance didn't die in a single night. Every shift in the wind, every bird that cut its song short, made him pause and listen. The land felt different, not lighter exactly, but less tense, as if some knot had been loosened in its core. Birds moved through the branches overhead without their frantic darting, and the shadows didn't seem as long. Once a fox stepped into the path ahead, amber eyes catching the sun. It looked at them for a moment, at the twins most of all, before slipping silently into the undergrowth. They camped once near a bend in the creek where the water widened and deepened. Ruth boiled coffee over a small fire while the girls gathered stones from the bank, arranging them into a shape Celis didn't recognize. He didn't ask. He'd learned that some answers weren't for him. By the time they reached the edge of the burned prairie, the day was already tipping toward dusk. The shack stood where they had left it, leaning stubbornly against the wind. Smoke still rose from the chimney, faint and pale, though they hadn't been there to tend the fire. Celis didn't comment. They crossed the threshold together. Ruth first, then the twins, then Celis, closing the door behind them. The sound of the latch dropping was louder than it should have been, as if marking a new boundary, one not easily crossed. The final reflection. The wind had shifted. Celis could hear it in the way it moved through the cracks in the boards, not whispering threats as it had before, but carrying something different. A warning, maybe, for anything that might think to cross this place. Or a signal to others like Ruth and the girls that here was a place someone had stood and said no. They didn't speak much in the days that followed. Ruth mended the roof again, this time with fresh canvas she'd taken from the chapel ruins. The twins worked the field without being told, their movements as precise and wordless as ever. Celis found himself watching them when they thought he wasn't looking, the way they bent to touch the soil before planting, the way nothing they tended seemed to wither. The thought came to him unbidden and unshakable, that whatever power had turned the riders back was still here, flowing through the roots and water and air. At night, he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the hollow quiet of fear, but the solid kind that settles after a storm. Sometimes in that stillness, he thought back to the auction, the knot of men, the smell of dust, the weight of the $10 bill in his hand. He'd believed then that he was buying something to protect. Now he knew the truth. They were the ones who'd saved him. The wind curled around the porch post, and for just a moment it felt warm.